name is Kelly Vlahos, and I am a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute and editorial director of our online magazine, Responsible Statecraft. I am delighted to be speaking with Ambassador Chas Freeman today on his role as principal translator for President Nixon in his historic trip to China 50 years ago this month. Freeman had been working on the China desk at the State Department in 1972 when he was chosen for this task, a job that would put him literally in a front row seat to history. The trip was dubbed by Nixon at the time to be the, quote, week that changed the world, and was as much of a cultural exchange as it was a political opening for the two countries. After the event, Freeman was given several top embassy assignments throughout the Asia Pacific and made deputy director for Taiwan affairs. He later served as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. So, Ambassador, I have many questions, but let's start with this. How would you describe what an auspicious moment that this was for the U.S. and China, that an American president, a fiercely anti-communist Republican at that, was visiting China in February 1972?
Well, it was certainly a dramatic moment for the world as well as for the participants in the journey itself. And it was an almost unprecedented instance of American initiative in statecraft. The United States had isolated China as part of containment policy for 23 years. And after the Korean War brought the Chinese in to combat with the United States, we did everything possible to exclude China from any role internationally. Nixon was, as you say, an ardent anti-communist, probably an opportunistic anti-communist too. He was, of all the Republicans of prominence in the time, he was the one most closely associated with Joe McCarthy. And yet he was also a statesman. And he saw the merits of including China in a renewed balance of power with the Soviet Union. And so this was all about geopolitics. It was about enlisting China rather than Taiwan in a containment policy, not directed against China, of course, but against the Soviet Union. And it was an effort to reach out to a country that we had a complex relationship with, and about which most Americans by that time knew absolutely nothing. So the television coverage of the visit was, as you suggested, quite a cultural eye-opener for Americans.
Yeah, I was spending some time looking at some of the footage of the trip, the setup for the trip, the preparations. There's a lot out there about Nixon and his accompanying Americans and going to different places of national significance, witnessing sporting events, cultural presentations, schools, the state dinners. Behind the scenes, beyond the cameras, did you see the trip as successful? Did you see a real opening between the two sides that wasn't just for show?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, I was there. I didn't see any of the television coverage, and I never have. I'm going by word of mouth in terms of its impact on attitudes. But the substance of the trip was really interesting. There is a fairly regular pattern that when there is a geopolitical breakthrough of some sort, the talks are divided into two layers. The foreign ministers, or the Secretary of State in this case, William Rogers, got to talk about all the things we disagreed with the Chinese about. We had to do that because we had to be able to tell our friends in South Korea and in South Vietnam at that time, in Pakistan, that we had not betrayed them. We had affirmed our longstanding positions on the issues of concern to them. So I got to be the interpreter for a lot of very difficult exchanges of quite sharp differences between the United States and China. In the meantime, President Nixon, as is the normal pattern, was off talking about pleasant things he'd seen and done, and the opportunities for cooperation that our compartmentalizing our differences would afford. So the visit proceeded very much in terms of a Chinese phrase, which is 求同存异, to set your differences aside and look for common ground. And we found that common ground in opposition to Soviet expansionism. We did not find common ground with regard to the wars in Indochina, which Kissinger and Nixon had hoped the Chinese might be helpful about. They were quite firm in their support for Hanoi, which of course ultimately won those wars.
I understand that President Nixon had at least one meeting with Chairman Mao, the leader of the Cultural Revolution and symbol of the communist ideology that Nixon and many of the U.S. had vilified. Were you in the room at that meeting, and how did Nixon handle that moment?
Well, there was no Chinese speaker in the room on the American side. This was very Nixonian, I guess. He frequently met with the Soviets without a Russian speaker or an American interpreter. I think he was concerned that Americans might be exposed to the press and leak information about meetings. So he just conducted them without regard to the State Department, the Foreign Service, or I think the basic principles of statecraft, which involve being aware of what the other side is actually saying by listening to it in the original language. Mao Zedong was at the time basically on life support. He was very ill, and the Chinese had to look for an opportune moment when he was better than most times, more alert, to schedule this meeting. So it was scheduled in the late afternoon of February 21st, 1972, on very short notice. And I think Nixon rose to the occasion, having read the transcript. He found Mao was a great strategic thinker. His contributions to military theory will be read through the ages. He was also a very good poet, and he was a very good classical Chinese poet, and so he had literary flair, and he was a student of history, and he was, of course, the unchallenged leader of China. His decision to respond to Nixon by offering Nixon a reception in Beijing did not go over well with lots of people in China, just as there was controversy in the United States among right-wing elements, pro-Chiang Kai-shek elements, and so forth. There were Korean War veterans and others in China who thought that embracing what they saw as American imperialism was a sinful and improper act. And this probably contributed to an attempted coup d'etat against Mao by his deputy, the head of the armed forces, Lin Biao, who died escaping China on an aircraft that crashed in Mongolia only a few months before the Nixon visit.
So I understand that the Shanghai Communique was the tangible outcome of the diplomatic outcome of this trip. Can you tell us what it was and why it was significant at the time?
Well, first of all, in diplomatic terms, it was very innovative. Joe and I suggested, precisely for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that it should record our differences up front in order to reassure our respective allies and friends. So it opens with a long recitation of very sharp differences about quite a range of issues in the Asia Pacific. But it then goes on to say, in a classic diplomatic maneuver, notwithstanding the above, and notwithstanding the different socioeconomic systems and ideologies and histories of the two countries, there are some things we can cooperate on. And among these is opposing the effort of any third party to achieve hegemony in the Asia Pacific. Now, this was, of course, directed at the Soviet Union, but by implication, it also included Japan, which, decades before, had attempted to achieve just such hegemony in Asia, and been defeated in 1945 after quite a lot of people died in China as well as in the Pacific. So the communique then went on to finesse the most difficult issue between us, which was the fact that thanks to American intervention in the Taiwan Strait, when the Korean War broke out, the Chinese Civil War had not ended. The two parties to it, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, and their respective nationalist and communist parties, were still at daggers drawn. And the United States recognized and promoted the international recognition of Taipei, that is Chiang Kai-shek's capital. So here was an anomaly. The President of the United States in the capital of a regime that we didn't recognize, while we did recognize its Civil War opponent, and in fact insisted on the right of that opponent to represent all of China in the United Nations and internationally. Part of what those of us in the diplomatic service at the time did was try to prevent China from having any role or even appearing in any international gathering or establishing diplomatic relations with any third country. So we finessed the Taiwan issue, and it wasn't easy to do that. It was deftly done by Nixon and Kissinger with Zhou Enlai, and it stands as a monument to the effective deferral of an issue. Unfortunately, we then did not take advantage of the time that we gained by deferring it to try to resolve it. So it has come back very much dangerously. It has festered rather than been resolved, and the Civil War may be about to resume.
Well, I mean, I do want to talk a little bit more about the trip, but you raised a very interesting point that I was going to ask you later anyway. It seemed like a door had been opened 50 years ago, but now that it's closed, where you raised the issue of Taiwan, at what point, and in your experience, did things shift the other way, where the good feelings, the trust building that had been formed 50 years ago had eroded and led the way for the complicated and more hostile relationship the two parties have today?
Well, the U.S.-China relationship has traveled quite a bumpy road in those 50 years. We went from a situation in the 1970s where the United States basically treated China as a protected state, meaning we recognized the stake in its continued independence and strength, but we didn't really see much role for cooperation with it. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, Christmas Eve, changed that because it directly challenged U.S. and Chinese strategic interests. And so in the 1980s, we had a relationship of entente, meaning a limited partnership for limited purposes. And we jointly and separately operated in Afghanistan to bring down the Soviet occupation, and ultimately we brought down the Soviet Union. And then at the end of the 80s, inflation and internal struggles in the Chinese Communist Party and transitions in China led to the student and worker uprising in Tiananmen and other cities in China. And and when this was put down brutally and decisively, finally, this totally destroyed the warmth in the relationship. By the end of 1989, a few months later, the Berlin Wall had come down, and the Soviet Union was no longer the menace it had been. So the strategic rationale for US-China relations evaporated. And we entered a period of confusion, at the end of which we began to remember the original purpose, which was integrating China into what we call the free world, meaning the non-communist world of market economics and international organizations. And that happened toward the end of the 90s with the China joining the World Trade Organization. So this is a pretty bumpy road. And then we get to this century, which begins with a US spy plane crashing into a Chinese jet and killing the pilot, and the spy plane landing in on an emergency basis, unannounced at a Chinese airfield in Hainan Island. And it's been downhill from there for two reasons. First, Americans who've been accustomed to being the most powerful society on the planet are now facing the prospect that we will no longer be. We have been since 1870. China already has an industrial economy that is more than twice the size of that in the United States. We have a bigger services sector. So we are having difficulty psychologically adjusting to this change, and so are the Chinese. They have been used to being vulnerable and weak, and now they're not vulnerable and they're strong, and they too are having adjustment pains. The second reason is, of course, that the understandings that underpin the Taiwan finesse, if you will, have gone away. Taiwan has democratized. It was not a democracy in 1972. It was an authoritarian regime under Chiang Kai-shek. And the people in Taiwan have begun to assert a separate identity and appear to want to continue to have one. And they also have a robust democracy, which is quite different from the political system on the mainland. So there has been a rupture in cross-strait relations. And second, I have to say with some sadness that the United States has walked away from most of the understandings that we undertook to facilitate the setting aside of the Taiwan issue. So it's back. And the Chinese, of course, now are no longer weak. They actually have the military capability to take Taiwan. And a lot of Chinese nationalists are saying, look, Taiwan appears to want to secede from China. The US appears to be backing that. We're strong enough to stop it. Why don't we? So there's political pressure in China, and there's political pressure here on ideological grounds to support Taiwan, which is why we are headed towards some kind of confrontation.
Is there any possibility for a moment, an opening of the door like there was in 1972, or are the conditions, the times, the era, the zeitgeist so much more different than it was 50 years ago that something like that is impossible?
Well, certainly there is no common enemy to compare with the Soviet Union. And what brought us together was a common concern about Soviet expansionism. Instead, the issues of the day, climate change, non-proliferation, trade issues, the rules of the road internationally, are far more abstract and less compelling to average people on both sides. So we're not going to be brought together very likely by these concerns, important as they are. And I think in some ways, the issue of climate change, which could end up if it went too far, with the genocide of the entire human species, is something we really ought to take more seriously than we do. But still, as a political realist, I have to say that is most unlikely to happen. So we come down to whether the United States, which has over the years greatly militarized our approach to foreign policy, can rediscover diplomacy and the art of the compromise. if we can do what we did in the Shanghai Communique, which is to say, look, there are bigger issues at stake than our mutual distaste for each other's ideologies. You know, China does things we don't like. The United States does things China doesn't like. But we have a real set of common interests that we ought to be pursuing. If we can, once again, set aside ideological differences and pursue a diplomatic solution, I think we could find one. But our politics in the United States is now very populist and xenophobic and anti-China. And I'm sorry to say that politics in China pretty much mirrors these characteristics and makes it difficult.
One more question. Was there one thing, or what was the one thing that you took away from that particular trip in 1972 that you might have used throughout your diplomatic career? What stuck?
Well, a fur hat, of course. A wonderful sea leopard hat. And the reason for this was that the renminbi yuan, the Chinese currency, was pegged at $2.50 to the dollar. 2 renminbi and 50 cents to the dollar. And a hat that should have cost $500 cost about $10. So, no, that's a facetious answer. I took away
you still have the hat?
I still do. It is a wonderful one of these fur hats that you see Chinese and Russians wearing in Siberia. Anyway, no, the thing I take away substantively is that with sufficient imagination and political courage, statesmen really can change the world and do so in a way that produces major benefits. The engagement with China that we began eventually brought down our major enemy, the Soviet Union, or had played a major role in it. It lifted 800 million people out of poverty. It produced a China that is very embedded in the Bretton Woods institutions that we created after World War II. And while there are differences about the future, China has every reason to want to support the continuation of much of the world order the United States created. So this is quite remarkable when you consider that in 1972, China was in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, exporting revolution everywhere it could, dealing in the United States with whatever dissident movement they could find, Puerto Rican independence movement, the American Indian movement, the Weatherman, the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, very opposed to us and our domestic tranquility, and of course now very accepting of both.
Wow. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. I feel like there are so many people out there who have either forgotten or were not born at the time, who have no idea how big this moment was. And I really appreciate you sharing your experience of it with us. So thank you.
My pleasure.